There you go.
Okay, great. Thank you for verifying. So some of the goals of the things that I want you to at least know by the time that we part ways today is to understand what happened to the housing market after World War II, what was the Federal Housing Administration and how it changed federal home ownership across the entire country. Who was left out of this concept of the American dream? The American dream, owning your home, having a car, having your children, all these different things. Um, and how is geographical segregation de jure and not de facto? Just to give you a quick explanation, de jure is by law and de facto is just by nature. So de facto, we assume that things just happen organically, whereas de jure are things that are actually intentionally done through policies and through decisions. So I want us to get us started by maybe submitting some words in reminiscence of what comes to your mind when you think about the neighborhood and community that you lived in growing up. What did it look like? The people that were in there, what was the maker? What was something that you remember? You can maybe submit 1 or 2 words and you can just do that in the comments. So maybe we can do that for a minute or two just to get some ideas. So yeah, I feel that, a lot of people had, grew up in a neighborhood where there were a lot of families, there were cars, there were, multitude of homes, probably was in a like a suburb or a cul-de-sac. There were parks nearby, I hear suburban, safety, cleanliness, that kind of cookie cutter type of style. And there's a reason for that, actually. There's a reason why when we think about neighborhoods and suburban places look a certain way and give the certain feel, this was actually made by the federal government. There were guidelines that influenced the shape of these things. But before we dive into that, I want us to understand what led us to get to that place in the first place. So around the end of the 1930s, we were finishing World War II, and so there was a lot of movement, both economic activity. We were coming out of a recession, and there was just so much investment happening in the country regarding manufacturing, regarding putting in money towards people. And so veterans after World War II, after successfully winning with the Allies, they wanted to come back home, get with their sweethearts, and start a family and buy a home. Really, for the first time in our country's history, become part of that American dream that we have so professed for so long. And in response, the federal government created the National Housing Act of 1934. So the overall goal was to provide housing and mortgages that were affordable for the average American. This was kind of the first time in history where the federal government really wanted to emphasize homeownership as part of the American life. And along with that, there were so many other benefits that were happening across the country. So there were VA loans, benefits for GIs. There was also a lot of subsidies in research and development. So car technologies, manufacturing, construction, uh, electronics, and also this was the first time that we massively developed interstate highway system. This was also the first time that credit came to be part of the American society, and this is kind of the start of our consumer-based society. Um, so the Federal Housing Administration also created some subsets of organizations to kind of carry out this process, and one of them was the Federal Savings and Loans Insurance Corporation, and this was to provide loans and loan insurance to people so that they could buy homes. There was also the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which saw homes that were about to get foreclosed or were at risk of being default, and they bought it and then they provided an insurance so that they would not and that it could retain homeownership. This was also the first time that amortized mortgages appeared in the country. And amortized mortgages are those that you could pay over an extended period of time, and so that there's no giant balloon payment at the end of it. And so this really changed the way that people were able to not only buy a home, but think about it as an investment. So getting home, let's talk about that. So before 1934, to buy a house, you probably had to put around a 30 to 50% down payment. So almost half the price up front before you get into the door. and you also had to pay the rest in a matter of 4 to 5 years. So for the average American, especially in a time of recession, that was nearly impossible. So in response, the Federal Housing Administration started insuring banks and started insuring people who were going through the loan process to say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to extend the time of the loan so that you only have to put either 0% to 10% down payment at the front. And then this is financed at a very low interest rate over 30 years. This is what we know today as, standard practice for most home ownership. You're putting your cash down payment, and maybe that's changed a little bit after COVID because people are just massively putting a lot of cash down. But this was kind of the first narrative for people to say, you get to buy a home, you get to be part of this opportunity, especially for veterans. It was to tell them, okay, now you've come back from the war. This is your time to start a family, and we're going to give you a home. We're going to give you accessibility for it. And there were massive communities that were also asking no down payment whatsoever for veterans. So, and I'll be talking a little bit about the GI Bill of 1944 in just a bit, but that was also another way for veterans to say, okay, we have this loan, we have this financial incentives to actually buy a house. So the federal government is actually incentivizing families to be homeowners and to have, that model of American life that we have yearned to this day. So if you see here, these are some of the media that was shared around, starting in the 1930s all the way to the 1950s. And, if you maybe you see this on the left side or not, but uh, a 6 bedroom house had a monthly payment of $35. Wouldn't that be nice nowadays? And they're showing some of the prices, and that you could make easy payments down to 15 years, and some of them were, I know, shocking, right? So some of these things have changed, but the length of the payment process and how we, pay mortgages over time has kind of remained since this time. So it kind of set the new precedent for how we live and how we conduct businesses around the housing market. So this was also the time where suburbia really came to be. Uh, so with increased access to, credit, now people could go ahead and buy their own personal vehicles. This was kind of the big boom of manufacturing. This was economies of scale started ramping up their operations, and so they started producing vehicles for the average American, for the American family. There was also the road width expansion, and so it was easier to get to and from with a personal vehicle. And also, there was a lot of open land outside of cities, and so economies of scale really allow for massive projects. And this is how suburbs came to be. Suburbs are kind of, planned spaces for people to live. Most often they have parks in the vicinity, and sometimes they've had schools, but usually the business activities remained either in the cities or in areas of close proximity. So I'm sure that many of you, and this is my assumption, that lived in a suburb, and probably this is similar to the makeup of what it used to be. In fact, from 1940 to 1960, suburban communities increased dramatically, and master plan communities grew by an incredible 126% around this time too. So everywhere across the country, they were building massive communities to say, okay, we're just going to find this big plot of land, we're going to work with developers, and the federal government was also providing a lot of incentives for developers to say, we're going to build this massive communities and we're going to house people, and then we're going to work with the private market and with banks to finance those loans so that we can have that home ownership, create that sense of family, create those communities. And so by the end of the 1970s, we had around 74 Americans living in suburbia. And at the same time, this was where most of the growth was happening. This is the years of the baby boomers. So around the 1950s to the 1960s, 83% of all population growth was occurring in suburbia. So some other fun facts to share is that before 1950, only 12% of households held a TV, and then by 1960, almost all households had a TV. So maybe you remember sitting down with your family, eating some dinner, and then watching some TV at night. And also, automobile ownership increased during this time by 20%. So people really started ramping up on those ideas. This was kind of like a massive effect of how we really shaped the American life. The Federal Housing Administration was that entity that kind of guided this process, and they did so through a set of policies and guidance and, providing incentives. So it was a monetary, a, legislative, and also a judicial type of process. Unfortunately, as part of this process, they also said certain guidelines for developers, certain guidelines for the private market to follow. And among those things, it was to preserve racial order and to maintain people in segregated ranks. This was through geographical segregation for the most part, and through the denial of financial opportunities and lending for primarily people of color. And we're mostly talking here about Black families and Latino families. So this is some actual language. This was the official language that was provided by the Federal Housing Administration, saying that uh, all deeds should have a prohibition for the occupancies of properties except by the race for which they're intended. So it was a guideline to say you cannot build an integrated community. You have to clearly demonstrate that this community, especially suburban communities, are for white people only. So you need to create things like racial covenants to say, we're only provide lending to white people. We're only gonna be providing a home or even any sort of financial incentive to white people if they are going to be in this area. So the belief was that if there were to be any sort of integration or proximity of races in living spaces, uh, there was going to be social destruction. The order that and the harmony that the federal government professed was along the lines of racial segregation. And one of the main things that was the platform to really promote this is that if there were to be Black people in this community, property values are going to dramatically decrease. The character of this community is going to become blighted. Services are just going to be worse, and there's just going to be a lot of social disruption. So one of the biggest tactics to really incentivize and to actually sanction this practice was called redlining, and it started in 1936. This was done by the federal government in collaboration with private entities, and it was an appraisal system. This was done across the nation, and it involved the 239 largest cities in the country, and it evaluated for financial risk and lending. And the biggest determinant to say this is a good place or this is a bad place was the presence of people of color, primarily of Latinos and white people. So if you had a green uh, color, then that meant you're great. You're good to go. You're going to receive the best credits. You're going to receive the lowest interest rates because we find your community to be a secure investment, a long-term investment. This is the best place to really put in your money. Second grade, maybe there's a proximity to somewhere that is not as ideal, but there's still an opportunity to provide those financial incentives. Third grade, okay, we're seeing some dangers here. We're starting to find that there's the risk of it degrading even further. So we might require you to pay higher interest rates because we don't see this as the best place. And if you were in red, it simply meant that we were not going to provide any sort of incentives. It was totally hazardous. Hazardous and blighted were two of the main words used not only by the federal government, but also by private companies. So pretty much the Federal Housing Administration said an integrated neighborhood is a financial risk, or the presence of people of color, and pardon my language here, but the presence of Negroes is an unstable neighborhood and a bad financial risk. So here you see a map, and if you can see the myriad of colors, that represents a geographical assessment, but also an ethnic assessment. So you might determine, um, oh, someone took back. So yeah, sorry. So you might see from here that, or you might determine that there were some areas that were predominantly white, such as the blue areas and the green areas, whereas the areas up north were the areas that had more racial integration or were more racially diverse, or were solely people of color. So this could be considered the urban ghettos or the hood, as we might know it today. Okay, let's move forward. So in addition to this, Black veterans were left behind of all the benefits for the American dream. So in 1944, the federal government enacted the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill, which really provided an opportunity for long-term development of all the war veterans. So these benefits included low-interest home loans, stipends to go to college and get an education, loan for business, uh, allow, uh, sorry, there was some comments here, but loans for businesses were also an unemployment benefit. So if you were not able to get a job or not open your own business, the federal government was going to give you a check. So in total, this is a low estimate that VA benefits were denied to 1.2 million Black Americans. And keep in mind, these veterans went to war and they even fought in segregated ranks, and they also should have been deserving of the same benefits that their fellow white counterparts did. So what was the major effect of this? This denied the right to accrue wealth and advance socially, educationally, as a business owner, with your family, and also to build wealth to pass down to your children and beyond. So along this, there were tactics to deny Black people of home ownership. So most of the areas that were subsidized in the country for home ownership had covenants that explicitly stated that said white-only neighborhood. And so, there were, and I'm going to show you a video later about that, but no lending. If people knew that you were a Black person, they would refuse loans because the private market still held the right to say, we will not lend you because of your race, because you're a financial risk. And then no education, even though that the federal government promoted this, a lot of institutions said that they they still maintain Jim Crow laws, which was in the South or even in the North. They would say we can only offer these classes to white people. And keep in mind, this was around the time of the civil rights movement as well. So they were fighting for these things, and yet the federal government actually allowed for all these things to consider the inclusion of Black people. So in New York and in the northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill supported home purchases by non-whites. So what were some of the results of these effects? This was a cascade of effects that were segregating people, not only socially, but economically, educationally, and geographically. So with this process, there was also only a rental market primarily available to people of color. So people of color were confined to inner city neighborhoods. And that's where we brought the idea that if you lived in the center of the city, you were probably impoverished. And so they started building vertical ghettos, which are these large projects that concentrated massive amounts of people of color. So in that same idea, there was this notion that this concentrated poverty was a threat to the rest of society and therefore needed to be confined to these spaces. They were blighted, they were risky, they were full of drugs, and the presence of that anywhere near the suburbs would lower property values. So some of the things that were happening at the same time were things like blood busting. Blood busting was if there were to be people of color coming into a white neighborhood, private sellers and buyers would start creating hysteria amongst white homeowners to say, oh, Black people are coming to your neighborhood. You need to leave before your properties decrease in value. So we're just going to pay you cash so that you can get out of here as soon as possible. And so they would buy these properties below market value and then inflate the prices and sell them to Black people so that they would just still create a new Black neighborhood, but they would still inflate the prices. And at the same time, there were subpar loans, which were primarily the only type of lending allowed to people of color. And these had a name amongst the private market called Negro loans. And the goal was to the conditions of the loan was to say you start at a very low interest rate, but in a year from now, it's going to peak up to say 15%, and then it can go up to 30%. So these were actual predatory loans that had no protection. And more often than not, these subpart loans would lead to foreclosing and defaulting on these loan payments. White flight was also the concept that when white people left a community, there was also a disinvestment because there was a higher tax base that would leave, and therefore that meant lower funding for schools, lower funding for businesses, lower taxing for them to have different types of services. So you had less money to fund for police, you had less money to fund for public works, and less funding to fund even fire services and electricity. So, and then on top of that, you had this concept of urban renewal. Urban renewal was kind of looking at these spaces that were considered to be blighted, considered to be of decay, of social disharmony, and therefore the federal government worked with private companies to demolish them. And this caused the eviction of thousands and thousands of Black families. And in fact, 90% of all the properties that were destroyed by urban renewal were never replaced. And the example that you have here is, and the picture that you see on the right, this was in 8 Mile Road in Detroit. This white neighborhood wanted to get better lending and mortgages offered to either buy another home or to bring more people into the neighborhood. And so the Federal Housing Administration, the private market, told them that they were too close to a Black neighborhood for them to be able to receive a loan because it was too risky. And so what they proceeded to do was they built a 6-foot wall between the two neighborhoods to physically segregate the ranks. And what happened was shortly after they built the wall, their mortgages were approved. And another thing that happens in American life, and I'm sure that maybe your parents or you are benefiting from right now, is wealth is primarily held through home equity. Home is kind of your nesting egg for saving more for retirement, passing it down to children, helping them buy a new home, or paying for something, paying for their education. When you're a renter, you don't make equity, and so you don't have the capacity to build that wealth. So I want to show you this video, and this was in one of the most famous planned communities in Philadelphia called Levittown. Oh, can you all hear the sound? Is it playing? Can someone give me a thumbs up?
I can't see it, but somebody else thumbs you up. I can't see it or hear it.
Oh, you cannot see it or hear it? Okay. Let me...
It allowed me to push play, like it's almost like a YouTube link that you hit play on yourself.
Okay, okay.
Anybody else seen it that way?
Yes, I just didn't try it.
Let me stop my screen and then share the actual video and share computer sound. Okay, can you all see this new player?
Yes, it just took a second.
In August 1957.
How about the sound? Do you all hear the sound?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay.
Levittown, Pennsylvania attracted international attention when violence erupted as William Myers Jr. and his family moved into the 3-bedroom house at Daffodil and Deep Green Lanes. In almost all respects, the Myers family is close to the Levittown norm. They have 3 small children, the youngest only 1 month old. Myers served for 2.5 years in the Army and was discharged as a staff sergeant. He works as a laboratory technician and is studying for a degree as an electrical engineer. His wife, Daisy, is a college graduate. The Myers home is modestly furnished, and their late model family car was bought on time. They are very close to the Levittown norm, except in one respect. William Myers Jr. and his family are Negroes in an all-white community. Levittown reacted in a number of ways to the new arrivals. There were several hundred who congregated on the street in front of the Myers house, and there were those among them who felt strongly enough to throw a rock through the picture window. But there was another large group who were repelled by this kind of behavior and organized to help Levittown accept its first Negro neighbors. Why did you select Levittown to live?
We were looking for a place to buy a home. We looked at Levittown, and we liked the homes here. We liked the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white. We were very happy to buy a home here.
How about your children? Have you talked with them about the Myers?
We have tried to keep the discussions away from the children. I feel that it's something that we adults should solve without bringing the children into it any more than we have to. We're doing it for the children, but I don't feel that they are old enough to understand the problem as it is.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
Can you give a basis for that judgment?
Yes, we used to live in Washington, D.C., and we saw a very good example of that there.
The repetition of an experience that was distasteful. Is there to be no escape from living near Negroes? And what of the dream of middle-class respectability? If a Negro family can afford what you can afford, how do you justify your feeling of superiority? The illogic of one's own position becomes apparent, and in self-justification, the old tribal myths are invoked. What other objections, aside from the effect on property values, do you have against the Myers?
The whole thing centers around the word integration. Well, as Mr. Myers said, because his home has been anything but peaceful since he moved in. He's got 3 children. And evidently, he feels that they will be accepted socially. And I don't feel that they ever will be. But the whole trouble with this integration business is that in the end, it probably will end up with mixing socially. And you will have, well, I think their aim is mixed marriages and becoming equal with the whites.
All right. Well, just to kind of debrief a little bit on what was just shared in the video. So the Myers family was heavily capable, very educated. It conformed to the standards and, as the reporter said, the norms of the Levittown community. They, that there was to be a social kind of condition in order for you to fit into this community, to say, we want you to be well educated, we want you to be, professional, we want you to have children. The only factor that really caused an uproar here was the color of their skin. And as we saw, the person being interviewed solely said that, their presence will lower property values and that integration and racial mixing was to be a threat to society. And this was a discourse that was also upheld by the federal government. It was passed down to society, and therefore it was justified. So this not only happened in Levittown, this happened for years and years across the country. There were people fighting constantly to maintain segregated schools, to maintain segregated neighborhoods. I mean, this was the time of Rosa Parks disrupting bus segregation. This was also the time where MLK was having his I Have a Dream speech. This was also the time where Brown versus Board of Education took place as a court precedent. And even then, there was still a lot of housing that was being denied to Black people. There were still a lot of financial opportunities being denied to Black people. And even when there was a fight to become integrated, a lot of these communities maintained those covenants, in addition to using different tactics to subvert any sort of integration. So what are the disparities of that today? What were the effects of this social segregation? This kind of constructed the idea of whiteness in the country. If you were white middle class, you were entitled to a home. You were entitled to your 2.5 children in a suburban neighborhood with a car, and you were allowed to thrive in your workplace so long that there was no presence of Black people or people of color. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government invested $120 billion. I'm talking to you about 120 billion. You think about how much that amount would be nowadays. That was spent in new housing alone, and less than 2% went to non-white people. And I'm talking about not just Black people, but I'm talking about Asian people, Latino people, or anyone who could be considered as people of color. Even after the Federal Housing Act of 1968, which was actually effected and signed 8 days after Martin Luther King was assassinated, outlawing racism and federal policy primarily in the housing language, the damage was already done. These neighborhoods were already settled. You could not just kick people out or bring people in if all the neighborhoods were already constructed. So there was this kind of self-fulfilled prophecy by the Federal Housing Administration on this part, you know, to say, oh yeah, Black neighborhoods are just going to kind of come to this place. But there were several factors that already affirmed those predictions. So for the first part, you had the disinvestment of white flight, which meant that amenities, resources, and other services are lost. Then you had lower tax bases, less businesses, worse school funding, so that you start concentrating poverty, you start lowering educational benefits and educational opportunities of advancement. So you're confining people to live in very small spaces with very little opportunities. And this also led to over-policing. This also led to concentrated people in very small rooms because of the inability to either get jobs or the inability to just progress in American society. So the community turns blighted, and therefore entities and municipalities start condemning them. They start shutting down services, or they just proceed to destroy the community as a whole. So this was also done through the Federal Highway Administration, in which they would target specifically communities of color, and then they would build highways in it, or they would spatially segregate communities of color by building long roads and highways and walls. So there were multiple tactics to continue this segregation in the country. So I want you to see the financial impacts of this in the long term. As of 2019, the Federal Reserve has indicated that the median net worth of a white family is $188,000. And then look at the median net worth of all other groups, especially Black people. So this is not even this is barely a tenth. It's like 15% of what a white household holds. And this is because of generations of being able to pass down that wealth, being able to pass down those investments, being able to sell your parents' homes, or at least they using their equity and their savings to at least help you move forward in your life. In total, this amounts to white people holding 85% of the wealth in this country. I mean, if you look at the share of the pie, this is incredible. And primarily this is through investments and through housing values. And even with home ownership, the presence or the knowledge that a person of color owns a home or it's in a BIPOC neighborhood, that also inherently lowers values because of the market desirability. So here we see also the percentage of actual home ownership by race. We're still going to see a predominant amount of white people still being homeowners up to this day. And even though that we've had the majority of other groups being able to, over time, attain a higher percentage, it's still not equal to that of white people. So this is an example locally of redlining in Denver. I'm not sure if you've been to Denver recently, but if you think around the Cherry Creek area, and not in the downtown proper, but in the proximities, those were considered to be the industrial sites or the areas that were undesirable to live. And so these were the historical sites where people of color would be housed because they were lower property values or because they did not have racial covenants. So as you can see, I'm sure that you can also see that where the parks on the east side are, that's where the most affluent sites are. And therefore, those were the most fitting places to receive FHA benefits. And this is kind of try to overlay these maps on top of each other to understand how you have the indication of redlining, what areas were desirable, and then what areas were considered to be blighted. It's kind of still in the same area, and how poverty is still dominated in this day. It might not be so that it's just social order. This is not just de facto. Poor people are supposed to be poor people, but this was actual decisions by the federal government that upheld this notion and inhibited people, especially people of color, from advancing economically, from getting a home, from getting an education, from receiving any sort of lending that would actually help them advance in society. So to just kind of close our conversation today, I want you to understand that housing as we know it is a product of intentional de jure and not de facto conditions that segregated America. Again, the federal government, in collaboration with the private government and state and local governments as well, decided that this was the way to go and therefore enacted policies and practices that promoted this. It was state-sanctioned racism. There's no other way to say that. And wealth accumulation was denied to people of color on top of other opportunities of advancement. And this created a domino effect. You had less education, less opportunities for jobs, even just social biases in the workplace. If you were able to get into a job, it was very unlikely that you were able to get in positions of leadership because of the notions and the distribution of power and the racial biases that also kept us from really seeing beyond color. So racism might not be an explicit part of people's lives. It might not have been an explicit part of your family or your own life. However, it is important to recognize that certain groups of people benefited from these de jure policies over time, in which we then created an economy, policies, and geographies that fed into it. We inherit a racialized society. I mean, this is why some neighborhoods might look the way that they do it nowadays, and they might look also, have a certain composition of people. So I know this is a lot of overwhelming information, and this is definitely in the past, but it's also still in the present. And I'm not asking you to go out and change the world. However, it is important to recognize, what is it that I can influence? How can I really reframe the way that I see things, or how do I give meaning to those things that I consider to be the norm, or those things that I don't even pay attention to? How can I influence my immediate sphere of contact? And in the long term, this is more of an organizational wide conversation. How do we create a more inclusive environment? How do we recognize this history and try to not only retrofit, but also find opportunities to amend that moving forward? Because we have ultimately not been able to provide the same benefits to everybody over the years. And so I just want to leave you with this quote from the late Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun. In order to get beyond racism, we must first take into account the concept of race. There is no other way, and in order to treat persons equally, we must treat them differently. And what he means is we must treat them with equity. I don't think that back in the day, the concept of equity was as widespread. So thank you so much for watching, and I am going to reshare the link so that for the September 28th webinar, you can vote for what topic you would like to see. And then in June, we'll be talking about labor laws in the United States, both in the past, what happened in the past, and then how that shapes how we work nowadays in the present. So thank you so much for listening. And I want to open some of the last 15 minutes for some conversation. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop presenting so that we can just be, oh, hold on. It says stop recording.